We all know the weather is getting more extreme all the time, but even without climate change, Earth is home to some beautiful and terrifying phenomena that most of us will never get to see. So today, a bit of a tour of the planet's most unusual weather features and a spiritual forecast to go with them. We begin with firenadoes. An ordinary tornado is scary enough, but imagine the fear when one is churning and burning at the same time. Sometimes known as a fire devil, these flaming tornadoes are caused when intense heat mixes with strong wind. The worst ones happen during forest fires because all the right conditions are in place. Blistering winds pick up the flames and turn them into a whirling fire spout with temperatures up to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The voracious killers can reach anywhere from 3 to 16 stories high and travel up to 200 kilometers an hour, incinerating anything in their path. They're famous for uprooting trees and causing spot fires all along the way. In 1923, a firenado swept through Tokyo, Japan, killing an astonishing 38,000 people in just 15 minutes. And in 2003, an Australian fire devil flashed across 300 acres in just 0.04 seconds. Thankfully, these destructive features are rare. Except in a figurative sense. As James says, we all make many mistakes. If we could control our tongues, we'd be perfect and control ourselves in every other way. But a tiny spark can set a great forest ablaze. And among all the parts of the body, the tongue is a flame. It can set your whole life on fire, for it is set on fire by hell itself. In the right conditions, the intense heat of anger and swirling vortex of resentment and frustration flash into a flaming firenado. That's why Paul writes, "Don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil." In other words, address problems immediately and don't let them churn out of control. The cost is just too high. Swirling anger and harsh words destroy relationships, set fire to our good intentions, and incinerate our Christian example and credibility. Words and actions matter. Don't use foul or abusive language, Paul adds. Let everything you say be good and helpful, so your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. And don't bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way you live. Remember, He has identified you as His own, guaranteeing you'll be saved on the day of redemption. Get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. Instead, be kind to each other, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God has forgiven you. Almost like the flip side of a firenado is the waterspout, a tornado that happens over the ocean instead of land. It can be up to 100 meters across, and it usually forms out of a thundercloud. In Thailand, about 50 waterspouts happen every month. When they reach land, the destruction is fierce. Amid a swirling speed of 360 kilometers an hour, water is sucked into the tube and pulled up. Sometimes it even pulls turtles and fish into the air. Most scientists think that's what accounts for what researchers call animal rain. As far back as Greece in 2000 BC, there have been reports of creatures falling from heaven, and it still happens today. In 1957, thousands of small fish fell from the sky during a rainstorm in Alaska. The same thing happened there with crabs in 2013. It's thought the creatures were just in the wrong place at the wrong time when a waterspout sucked up the sea, then turned the streets into a giant seafood market. In Honduras, the sky rains fish almost every year. The most common reports of animal rain involve frogs, fish, and worms, but nobody has ever seen a tornado drop a catch of fish or anything else, so the phenomenon remains a mystery. In the Bible, waterspouts are sometimes called whirlwinds, And it's not surprising because they're common along the coastline of Syria. When the funnels reach land, they become sandstorms. The whirlwinds are a symbol of God's might and power, such as when the prophet Elijah is swept up to heaven in a whirlwind, or when God speaks to Job out of a whirlwind. But sometimes the waterspouts and whirlwinds are a symbol of destruction or God's judgment. The righteous have an everlasting foundation, says Proverbs 10:25, but as the whirlwind passes, so the wicked will be no more, as scattered and as helpless as Honduran fish. We have to recognize the sovereignty of God and His right to make demands on our lives. Now, He won't force us to be obedient, and thank the Lord He does not zap us back into line or treat us as we deserve. But we can't sow our wild oats, then pray for crop failure. As the prophet Hosea put it, those who sow the wind will reap the whirlwind. In other words, sin has consequences, both eternal and in the here and now. In Venezuela, at the junction of a lake and a river, you'll find what's called the everlasting storm. More than 250 times a year, lightning flashes across the sky for about 9 hours straight. In October especially, you get 28 flashes per minute, so they can be seen 400 kilometers away. Some say the storms are caused by methane gas in the lake. Others say it's just the unique weather conditions in the area. Either way, the bolts are beautiful and potentially dangerous. In most world religions, lightning is another common symbol of God's power and presence, but not all lightning is created equal. Some kinds are rare, like volcanic lightning. When Italy's Mount Vesuvius buried Pompeii in 79 AD, lightning over the summit was widely reported. Today, active volcanoes in Italy and Chile have revealed the terrifying beauty of this eruption disruption. It's worth noting that unlike regular bolts, volcanic arcs do not descend to the ground. Instead, they cluster, producing up to 300 normal lightning forks. One theory is that the dense particles in the ash clouds rub against each other, causing enough static electricity to charge the lightning. Since that always happens high in the sky, another cause may be volatility caused by temperature variation, as heat from the volcano clashes with the ice crystals in the clouds above. Think fire and ice. Figurative lightning is also quite a spectacle, but people get hurt, and it's usually found when a situation is critical and something is about to blow. We rub up against each other, creating static that lets the bolts fly, and not in a good way. One clash and flash leads to another, and before you know it, a wholesale eruption is underway. Look, when the temperature of our personality or emotions runs counter to what's happening around us, volatility is almost inevitable. The solution is found in patience, understanding, and humility. Back in Ephesians 4, Paul says, "Always be humble and gentle. Be patient, making allowance for each other because of your love. Try hard to stay united in the Spirit, bound together with peace. Throw off your former way of life and let the Spirit renew your thoughts and attitudes. Put on your new nature and be like God, righteous and holy." Take a lesson from ball lightning, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's round. Extremely rare, the phenomenon was first described hundreds of years ago. One of the most famous cases was in 1638 at a church in Devon, England. During a thunderstorm, a ball of lightning entered the church, rolled across the room, then exploded, killing 4 and injuring 60. Still, many scientists were skeptical. Then in 2012, the first video of ball lightning was posted online, and the prevalence of phone cameras has led to several documented cases since. But researchers still don't know exactly how or why it forms. The best guess is that, in rare cases, ordinary lightning hits the Earth and sucks out the oxygen in the sand, turning it into pure silica vapor. A 2007 experiment replicated that effect, and it looked like this. It's pretty easy to see why some scientists think UFO sightings in the past may have sometimes been ball lightning. I've had some personal experience with this. In 2009, Susan and I were checking into a Memphis hotel. I was outside with the luggage and she was inside taking care of the room. According to Sue and the receptionist inside, there was this white circle of light about 2 to 3 feet across that suddenly appeared behind me when my back was turned. It was about 6 feet off the ground and 10 feet behind me when all of a sudden it exploded with this deafening crack. I just about had a heart attack, but the energy dissipated sideways and away from me. I didn't have a scratch. I was irked that I missed the whole thing, but I was grateful to be in one piece. But spiritual lightning still hurts churches when the electricity among believers goes rogue. The key is to channel that energy with humility and love into the things that really matter, and to prevent those highly charged explosions that do so much damage. Like heat and electricity, cold can be deadly too. An example is brinicles, which are found mostly in the Arctic and Antarctic oceans. Lurking deep beneath the sea, these dangerous downward icicles stab into the water, destroying anything that gets in the way. Also called fingers of death, they form when water freezes and traps brine. Because salt lowers the freezing temperature of water, salty or briny water is pushed downward by a natural current, then freezes quickly. In fact, it happens so fast you can actually watch the fingers form in real time. And because they freeze so quickly, they're ruthless, trapping sea creatures inside them as they solidify. And if the brinicles reach the ocean floor, it creates an icy web known as a pool of death. Anything that comes into contact with it perishes. Brinicles were only discovered in the 1960s, but have fascinated divers and researchers ever since. Likewise, we have to avoid the icy and deadly cold of legalism and religiosity, condemnation that stems from a lack of love and empathy, and the icicles of ego that stab anything that gets in the way of what we really want. The Hebrews, of course, knew nothing about icicles, but the rabbis did talk about spiritual hot and cold, represented by a snake and a scorpion. The snake was said to bite with the hot poison of passion and earthly desires, whereas the scorpion injected the cold poison of apathy and indifference toward God and others. The rabbi said the antidote was prayer and a true examination of our motives and intentions. It's a really good place to start. Because a creeping pool of spiritual death traps anyone caught in its icy web. Anytime we freeze people out, demand the letter of the law instead of extending love and mercy, or react with cold indifference to the plight of others, nothing changes. The problems and their victims get frozen in place. But it doesn't have to be that way. Back on shore, the cold creates another natural wonder, but this one is beautiful instead of barbaric. This is a frost flower. Near the southern oceans of Antarctica, they bloom and grow on the surface of sea ice when the conditions are just right. Lovely and delicate, the frost flowers need calm, windless conditions when the air is colder than the ice. When the cold, moist air comes into contact with the sea ice, it wicks the moisture from it, forming frost and trapping salt and bacteria inside. They grow in clusters of 3 or 4 centimeters that spread over large areas. In 2009, an American research team found a frost flower meadow in which the creations contain more than 1 million live bacteria drawn from the sea ice. The bacteria may hold the key to understanding how life can survive in harsh conditions. A variation on this is hair ice, which grows on the surface of decaying trees. Mushroom spores inside the wood push the moisture to the surface, where it freezes and blooms outward because of the water welling up behind it. That's a really good reminder that beautiful things come from the decay of things we have to leave behind. When we're willing, God can reshape our attitudes, the way we think, and our circumstances. That can even happen in the most harsh of conditions, provided our hearts are calm and serene. That's what God meant when he said to David, "Be still and know that I am God." In other words, be calm. Trust me and watch what I'm about to do. If you think about it, even the decay of our mortal bodies leads to the bloom of eternity. We have God's promise on that. Now, you know that the rainbow symbolizes God's promise to love and sustain his creation, but have you heard of fire rainbows? They're the most rare of all optical weather effects because, like so many weather features, they only form when conditions are perfect and when the person on the ground is in exactly the right spot to see them. Fire rainbows happen when the light from the sun reflects through ice crystals in extremely high cirrus clouds. The sun has to be high enough and the clouds have to be in the right position. Then, if someone on the ground is in the perfect position to see the sun hit the crystals, voila! Because fire rainbows need ice crystals to form, they only happen high in the sky and only in some geographical areas. As it turns out, Los Angeles, California is the best spot on Earth to see the rarities, because the sun there is so high in the sky more often, compared to places like England. Seems to me that fire rainbows are an awful lot like spiritual insight. To fully see God at work in our lives, we have to elevate him to the highest place. But then circumstances have to be absolutely perfect so it's clear that God is intervening. And then we have to be in the right spot with the right perspective to see that it's not coincidence and it's not karma and it's not dumb luck, but the direct action of God himself. Of course, rainbows almost literally pale in comparison to the northern lights, also called the aurora borealis. The energy behind both comes from the sun. The sun creates something called solar wind, which drifts away from that giant star carrying tiny particles called protons and electrons, which are essentially the building blocks that make up everything in life, including you and me. When the solar wind reaches Earth, it runs into our magnetic field, which is a natural protective blanket around the planet to protect us from space debris and radiation. The magnetic field forces the solar wind to travel around the Earth, but also guides the protons and electrons away from the middle and toward the North and South poles. Whenever the solar wind leaks through the magnetic field and runs into the Earth's atmosphere, the protons and electrons release energy, and that's what causes the northern lights. It's like those protons and electrons from the sun shake up the particles in the atmosphere like a big bottle of pop, but the energy released is in the form of light, not bubbles. Different types of particles make different colors. Oxygen gives off red and green light, and nitrogen makes blue. Our eyes see green the best, so it dominates when we look at the spectacle. And we see the lights best when we're in the darkest place possible. That's also where we see God the best. When we're suffering or uncertain and there's no distracting light from the things we normally rely on, like our own talent and ego, the beauty and power of God come into sharp, dazzling focus. That's why you often hear palliative Christians talk about how they've never felt closer to God. In a spiritual sense, our energy comes from the Son too, the Son of God. He sends us out into the world with the essence of life, helps us work through the barriers that get in the way, and shakes up the atmosphere around us to release the incredible light of love found in Jesus. That light is often the polar opposite of what the world thinks or values, but it shines through the darkness in a living, luminous testimony to faith and service to others. In Ephesians 5, Paul says, "Live a life filled with love, following the example of Christ. He loved us and was sacrificed for us. Don't be fooled by those who try to excuse their sins and don't participate in what they do. For once you were full of darkness, but now you have light from the Lord. So live as people of light. For this light within you produces only what is good and right and true. If we do live as people of light, others will recognize us as the energy and reflection of God's infinite love. People won't have to wonder if we're Christians. They'll be able to tell whether. Have a great week.